All right. Well, let's see. So, Pini, are you ready? I like to start on time, but maybe you like to wait until people trickle in. It's up to you.
It's up to you. You run this show.
All right. So I will then run this show. Let's rock and roll. Good morning, Ilya. Welcome, Alexandra. Welcome, Helena.
Good morning.
Morning. So let's start. So we are going to continue today, giving Pini Benor, our welcome guest speaker, an opportunity to complete his discussion, which I will briefly summarize at this point as a discussion of value conflict and choice procedures, social choice procedures, including voting, and how social choice procedures can be effective in addressing and integrating situations of value conflict. And if Pini has a different way of summarizing where he's at, then he can do so. And then later today we'll talk about some more. We're going to transition from this to a discussion of social contract theory. But Pini, why don't you please take it away?
Okay, so yes, a comment about your summary. Your summary did not get to the last maybe 15, 20 minutes of the discussion last time, and what I'm going to cover today. It's no longer really about procedures and procedure for voting or social choice. It's really, I would say, think about understanding individual value conflict and decision-making under uncertainty. This understanding, think of this as a tool to understand social change and the politics around social change, and as a tool to understand the conditions for a stable, let's say, liberal democracy. So I'm really thinking about this understanding of how individuals make decisions under uncertainty, and of course, how organizations make decisions in a society makes decisions with uncertainty. But this understanding is a tool to understand politics and social change and so on. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to demonstrate. I hope that makes sense.
It does to me, so please carry it away.
Okay, so this is, I'm going to go back just a little bit and go over some grounds that I covered last time. Hi, everyone, first of all. And thanks for engaging with this topic, which I think is great. And just as an autobiographical note, I've been working on this when I was in graduate school, more than 35 years ago. And for a long time, I've not worked on it. But recently, under the influence of Athena and our project for refounding democracy, I started working on this again. So this is the fruit of that. All right, so going a little bit back over grounds I covered yesterday, just to warm up, we talked about the logic of cognitive revisions and think about how some form of inquiry or other influences on our minds make us change our minds over time. So in the cognitive or epistemological world, we start from believing something, we believe a proposition P, we may consider it very likely, and then over time we begin to see reasons for something else that may entail the opposite of our belief. And then we may become agnostic. We consider both P and not P possible. And over time, we may actually come to believe the opposite. And this describes in many ways the progress of science. Science changes, theories change, very basic principles in theories change. So how do they change over time? Something like this. And something similar happens with values. We begin, at some point, we have value that dictates our decisions, at least in a certain area. So we have a value that tells us that a certain option is on top, and we think that it's very likely to be the best and really only the best. And then we may begin to see reasons to judge according to another value, which entails that something else is best. And this change, this beginning to see the reasons, very often in terms of values, or in the case of values, is a result of social change. We see what's going on in society. We see other people who are different, who value differently and make decisions differently, and that may influence us in various ways. They may fall in one of our circles of identification, or other reasons cause us to begin to open our minds about what's possible. We may become agnostic. We consider both options now admissible, the one that's best according to one value and the one that's best according to another value. And then we may change our values, and we may switch to another primary way of ranking options. So that's the process of cognitive change. And this process requires an open mind, which is very important for democracy. So talking a little bit more about open-mindedness, there are certain kind of phenomena that have to do with the dynamic of values and social values. So first of all, recognizing and being continuously aware of your own value conflict, your own predicament, makes you likely to make you more open-minded. For example, if you have multiple values with different rankings, more possible actions or policies or options are admissible, are acceptable, and that creates more overlap with other people's sets of admissible options. And then there is another process, which is maybe this value conflict causes some tension, or the uncertainty about some proposition in the world, or about assessing probabilities. That uncertainty may be difficult to bear. It may cause tension. You may want to reduce the uncertainty, both because of the psychological pain or because you just want to know. And then you engage in some kind of inquiry, and you end up maybe changing your value. But even if at the end you narrow the range of uncertainty, the process of going through the change, if it's a process of inquiry, not just a causal change where somebody influences me, causes me to believe something. If it's a real kind of inquiry, it also increases open-mindedness. The engagement in inquiry increases open-mindedness. And this is why participation in citizen assemblies, participation in civil society, this is why civil society is a great thing for democracy. Because in civil society, you have organizations. They are largely independent of government, and they engage in various activities. I saw a building in one of my hikes around Kiev, a building that was constructed at the end of 19th century for the education of poor women. And it was built by a certain society, civil group that wanted to help poor women in Kiev. I mean, these people came together, they raised money, they made decisions together, they deliberated. That process, that engagement creates a lot of open-mindedness. And that is why civil society is great for democracy. The independence of these organizations from government and other sources of power. So that's about open-mindedness. So these dynamics are very, very positive. They lead to increased tolerance in a socially diverse and dynamic democracies. But this doesn't work well when society is polarized or is undergoing a process of polarization. Now, before I talk more about polarization, which is kind of my last subject, I want to talk a little bit about inquiry and experimentation. So when there is serious debate about policy, maybe there is uncertainty about the policy's consequences, there is a great value, or could be a great value, in experimenting, trying different policies. Now, how do you do that? How do you try different policies? How do you try different laws or different versions of laws, different regulations? Well, if you have a federal structure in the country, you can have different regions, states, provinces, cantons, that can pursue different policies and different laws and regulations. And the country as a whole observes the consequences. And as you observe the consequences, it becomes clearer what these consequences are and how we should value and rank these policy options. So a federal structure allows this kind of experimentation, and it's a way to reduce uncertainty on a national scale using experimentation. So this is very useful in diverse dynamic democracy when there is social change. Federalism is a good thing for stable democracy because it allows experimentation. So I think that's a very important point for political scientists.
Can I jump in with, there's a famous line in the US that the states are laboratories of democracy. And I think these are places where ideas can be tried out on smaller scale and maybe within a more coherent or cohesive political community that can then deliver lessons that can be used in other states or at the national level. And certainly we can see an argument why the European Union, which is different but also a federal entity, offers some of the same advantages.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now let's talk about polarization. So here is an example in the state of Wisconsin in the US, which raises the question, what happens when a party, one of the two major parties in this case, keeps losing elections, but is not adjusting. It's not adjusting its values, it's not adjusting its beliefs. So Wisconsin Republicans, okay, they are caught in a bind. What their base wants, which is a small or some minority of their voters that have very strong views, what this minority of voters for the Republican Party, it's a large minority, but it's still a minority. What they want, the majority doesn't want. And the party is somehow bound to this subset of voters, and it's not changing. And now there are consequences in Wisconsin, which are things like the opposite party, the opposing party, the Democratic Party, is winning elections on a large scale. And recently, there was an election to a very important Supreme Court, Wisconsin Supreme Court, judge role. And the issue around that is abortion. And the Democratic judge or the liberal judge candidate won again, frustrating the Republican Party. But this situation, when there is a party that's bound to a subset of its voters that has very strong views, is an example of polarization. There is a lot of research in the last few years because of what's going on in the US, a lot of research in the US, but not only in the US. I mean, clearly polarization happens in other countries. It happens in countries that are on the verge of autocracy or of autocratic government, like Brazil, you can say, maybe India, Poland, Hungary. There are examples other than the US. So there is a lot of research, and this is an example of a research from Pew Research Center. It's a pretty major social research organization. Looking at, this is a survey or a value survey, ideological consistency based on a scale of 10 political survey questions. And they ask how different the parties are the views consistently liberal versus consistently conservative. And you can see the distribution of views on some kind of a score they created. The differences are pretty narrow in 1994, 2004, and looked what happens in 2014. And now, almost 10 years later, it probably is worse. The gaps between the parties are increasing. That's a sign of polarization. So to define polarization, this is not a very good definition, but it's a beginning of something. So I may be, very different than you in my beliefs. If my beliefs, or many of them, most of them, or my core beliefs are very inconsistent with yours. I believe in the existence of God. You don't believe in the existence of God. I believe that, morality is based only on what God says and you don't. And so these are pretty deeply inconsistent beliefs. And these are just some examples. In terms of values, similar thing. My values may be generally largely inconsistent with yours. So that's a situation where we are very different. And if we are parts of big groups that are like this, then we have polarization in society. And closed-mindedness is related to this. So a society that has a tendency to be polarized is a society where there is social change. Groups kind of close ranks. They narrow their beliefs and their values, and they become more different than other groups. So social change is very important here. So I have kind of two basic theorems based on these observations. Closed-minded, these are kind of social science observations or laws, if you want. It's a little grandiose to call them laws, but closed-mindedness causes and is caused by polarization. And once polarization sets in society, it tends to reinforce and maybe amplify itself, and which is why this is dangerous for liberal democracy. Okay, so these are some comments about polarization. Now I want to talk a little bit about the psychological mechanisms. So I want to talk about two mechanisms. One I call self-denial or defense mechanism. So I imagine, okay, that I am or you are in a situation where there is social change, there are other groups, immigrants come in, they have different values. So I feel threatened, I'm defending myself, I'm defending my identity. And in defense of my identity, I have to solidify my values. I have to be very clear with myself. These are my values. I'm like this and not like that. I cannot equivocate. I cannot tolerate the value conflict or the cognitive conflict. So this is a mechanism of defense. And even if you have stories in the US in the last generation, there's been great change about the tolerance of homosexuality. And there are people, very conservative people who have children or siblings who came out and, they love them. It must have opened their mind to some extent about the acceptability of homosexuality and homosexual relations and marriage. But they were in conflict, and some people feel threatened by that, and their narrow values solidify. So that's the mechanism of defense. And then there is another mechanism, which is simplification. Simplify or deny, simplify your understanding of the other. We like to think about ourselves as sophisticated, and everyone is like that, as complex person. I'm not a simple person. Who's going to agree that they are simple? We like to think of our own complexity, but it's harder to see the complexity of others. And when there is value conflict and value change, there is this psychological process of seeing the other in a simplistic way, denying the complexity of the other, denying the idea that the other may share some of my values. So this is the process of simplification. And here's another result from this survey of the Pew Research Center about polarization in the United States. Between the parties, if you aggregate these kind of mechanisms over a large number of people, you get this kind of thing. That if you ask people to what extent the opposite party is a threat is a threat to the foundations of the country, that's a very strong idea. that someone else is a threat to my foundations or the foundations of the way I think this country should be. And people who say that they think about the other party as a threat, those numbers have increased very significantly in the last 20 years. Where this is 20 years before the last 10 years. How is it now? It probably is worse. So this is polarization, and it's dangerous. Okay, so I want to conclude by connecting the idea of social change and value conflict to two possible paths that the democracy can take. So the idea is this: start from the left. You have social change. It tends to induce value conflict on individuals, uncertainty about values, and maybe the condition that they often make decisions without knowing exactly what the single right thing to do. And if society takes the open-minded, tolerant, liberal path, and this is a path that is associated with strong and broad identities. Again, if you think about civil society, why this is important, the idea that there are all these groups of professionals in different professions and neighborhood associations and whatnot, it means that a person belongs to different groups, different circles of identification. So when you have broad multi-circle identities, then the value conflict leads to the idea that maybe options that were previously unacceptable are now acceptable to you. More options are admissible to more people. And this enables more compromise in political decision-making. And it enables stable liberal democracy and broader solidarity in a nation. So this is one path from social change. And, this is very important because social change is a global condition. And it's going to be even more of a global condition now. There is no stop to broad immigration, partly because of global warming, and that's just one cause. There are other causes of social change, and they're not going to relent and relax. So how does society respond to social change? So this is one path, and here's the other path. Other path is where people become uncomfortable. They feel threatened in this situation of social change and value conflict in society and maybe in their own minds and hearts. And then take this other path where maybe some unacceptable options like having someone like Trump as president becomes now acceptable. And it's the closed-minded, exclusionary path. You have strong but very narrow circle of identities, and fewer options are admissible to more people. And if you have polarization, that makes this worse. Okay, this kind of a feedback loop. The polarization makes you feel more uncomfortable when there is social change. So this leads to more polarization. It leads to less compromise. It leads to narrower solidarity and a liberal constitution that is threatened. So that's the other path. And the question, I think, for us is which path will democracy take? This is a very pertinent question, let's say, for a number of countries today. So that's how I'm concluding. So any questions or comments, I'd be happy to entertain.
Okay, Pini, thank you very much. I'm going to, first I'm going to ask Pini, we're going to have to be careful about, going to ask you to turn off your microphone, because we're going to have to be careful to have only one of our mics on at a time to keep down the audio feedback loop. Speaking of feedback loops and positive reinforcements, this is another one we have to care for. So I want to open this up to questions and discussions, starting with myself. So if you are in Kiev like me, you may not have had a great night. I slept on the couch away from the windows. A friend of a friend I heard of slept in his bathtub with a blanket and a pillow. Reportedly, it wasn't that bad, but doesn't sound like great. And so, why is that? Why did we have a bad night here in Kiev? The immediate answer, of course, is because there was a threat of cruise missile attacks coming from the Russian military. But then you ask, well, why was that? Why were we under this threat? And you trace it back, and you actually don't have to go that many steps back to get into the material that Pini was just presenting. I would, maybe this is nothing, I'm supposing nothing novel for those in this conversation circle, but you have at the origin of this threat is a closed-mindedness, a value narrowness, and an invulnerability to outside information in the mind and soul of Vladimir Putin. And by the way, let me wish, so today is May 9th. Let me wish a Russian bitter defeat day to all who celebrate, which I certainly do. But bitter jokes aside, what the choice you could say we have in Russia, a choice mechanism that is a policy choice mechanism that is broken, that is not responding to new information, is not updating its beliefs, is not responding to value conflicts in any kind of healthy way. And this is the ultimate endpoint of that process of positive reinforcement that Pini was describing. And there's we can, and I want to touch on a couple of things around that. One is, so you might ask, what are the kinds of social implicit questions that in Pini's discussion is why does this happen, or what are the mechanisms that would inhibit this positive feedback? Or I think it's a positive feedback loop, not in the sense of positive being salutary or good, but in the sense of just the technical term that each increment adds to the total and creates is a reinforcing feedback loop. So one of the themes of Pini's presentation is that we have multiple identities. We are in multiple groups, and this aids in our value stability, our exposure to different kinds of influences, different kinds of environments in which we need to manage value conflicts. And there has been certainly I'll speak more from the US experience, there's been a deterioration in civil society and these kinds of social organizations that provide people with multiple identities. There's quite a famous book called Bowling Alone by the sociologist Robert Putnam. Bowling is you've probably seen, I guess it's not much of a sport or an activity in Ukraine, but you've probably seen pictures of it. You have, if you've ever seen the movie The Big Lebowski, bowling is a sport that they do. You got a big ball and you roll it down and you try to knock over some pins. So it used to be, this is a very big deal in the US, across lots of especially smaller towns, and you had leagues and people would come home, get off work and they would go bowling with their friends. So increasingly these leagues have deteriorated. People no longer have time or perceive themselves as having time to engage in these kinds of activities. the parent-teacher association, the civic groups, the things that hold the community together are increasingly have deteriorated as people say that they have less time or they're more stressed, and in any case, they're allocating their time in other ways. And this web of associations, it would seem there actually strong political implications to this. That webs of associations had the effect of bringing people into regular contact with the people they didn't politically disagree with, and they had to work out various challenges without with a more diverse range of people. And the deterioration of civil society in general, these kinds of volunteer, non-governmental, community-based associations has increased polarization. I in a minute want to relate this discussion back to our discussion about, believe it or not, about social cost benefit analysis and about decision making in public projects, but I want to pause before doing that and invite questions. There's several that have been entered into the chat, but I'm going to invite, starting with Mikola, to bring if you're still interested, to bring the question to the group.
Okay. But my question been about the role of technology and social media, not only technology as pure as distributing content, but as a cultural factor, because the information bubble, it not about the spread of information, it kind of tribes, kind of digital tribes, which strictly divide with my own and alliance, and as for me, it decrease of practice listening and change opinion. It about decrease of the participation practice. And to continuation this issue, I'd raise the question about the role of culture, or role of cultural policy in the treatment of polarization. What kind of cultural policy we need? What requirement we can shed to the cultural leaders to change something on this stage? Because talking about the political actors who engage in this kind of antagonism practice, because it might be because the lack of the ground, lack of the stage to express myself in other way. Maybe we need more diverse cultural stage to allow people, allow different actors to emerge, to show you of an ego, and to have satisfaction in other way, instead of beat the competitors on the political stage.
This is a fascinating topic, and thanks for the question. We maybe naively thought when social media was starting that, well, we're going to have just more opportunities to get information quickly and to share, and this will be great, and this will actually be really good for democracy because we'll be in conversation more. But there's a few things that we maybe lost track of. One, in the, let's say, the older form of social exchange, exchanges were intrinsically local. That is, you didn't, I didn't chat with people from Scandinavia or with people even in outside of my town on a very regular basis. If I made a long distance phone call, it was expensive, and therefore it was generally to my grandparents only. And the technical constraints that led to geographic constraints imposed a structure on discussion that was highly geographic, and that meant that in a way that you were thrown together in a local community and to figure it out together or not, but you were not creating these kinds of tribes. And second, these groups that appear online, of course, not only are they not geographically located mostly, but especially when it comes to political issues, but of course they can be, I'll use the word, infiltrated by bad actors who are like the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, which is deliberately showing up in social media groups to spread the seeds of polarization. And third, I think, lost track of the fact that these platforms that are hosting these conversations are profit-making entities. I'm not saying they're evil, but I'm saying they're designing the experience for you. The individuals who are in these communities do not design their own experience. They don't bring out the coffee pot or the tea, samovar, and create the community conversation. There's someone else who does that, and there's really no opportunity even to discuss how that is done from the ground up. It's a fascinating topic, I think, about how technology, or the technology of communication and conversation and collaboration, may influence or substantially constrain the kind of democracy we can create. Democracy showed up on the world stage not long after the printing press showed up on the world stage. The Gutenberg, or that's actually, by the way, that's actually not true. The printing press was originally developed in Korea centuries before, but let's not get too far down that road. Let's say there was an enormous change in the Gutenberg printing press was important in that you were bringing movable type to Latin text, and there were also technical improvements of the type of ink and the type of metal that was used. Anyway, the point being, you can print a lot of stuff a lot more quickly, making it possible for civil society to emerge in a much stronger form than it had before. And this had clearly a lot to do with the emergence of the Protestant Reformation and with the Enlightenment and the spread of ideas about democracy on which liberal democracies today are founded. And we haven't really maybe examined enough how if we fundamentally change the way that we have conversations about politics, so we have conversations about our community forms, if that technology for conversation is fundamentally changed and is now in privatized, technocratic, corporate hands, how does that change the kind of political structures that will emerge? I think we haven't had enough conversation about that, and we haven't figured out what that means for our constitutional order. And do we have to say, following up on Nicola's point, do we have to have state cultural policy that cultivates forms of discussion, forms of conversation that are not controlled by the engineers at Twitter and Facebook? and Google? I don't have an answer, but it seems like a damned important question. Are any follow up on that, or other, or if not, then other questions? Julia.
Hi, thank you. So this discussion is fascinating to me because it brought to my mind the book The Twilight of Democracy by Anne Applebaum, where she kind of describes how, you know, different political actors, they kind of use, they at the outset of their political path, they kind of started radicalizing themselves for political gains for different reasons, but it all comes down to playing on the perception, you know, in order to gain political support, it's about the perception that you are a loser in a certain way, economically, politically, and a lot of people who tend to have anti-democratic, autocratic tendencies, they use that rhetoric a lot. And that's actually something we discussed when Kiev School of Economics had behavioral economics course. I think one of our final tests was about Brexit.
Which course? What was it, Carl?
There was a short course on behavioral economics by Kiev School of Economics, led by one of the local professors, and I participated in that one. And one of our final assignments was discussing the case of Brexit and how the public opinion was manipulated to think that Brits were losing from being member of the EU. And, you know, one of my original questions during this discussion was, well, are there paths for economic policy to kind of address that? You know, can we make people be less polarized if we make them better off? But I think the more I was thinking about it, the more it came to me that it's all about the perception, because a lot of there was currently an article on The Economist where, you know, they said that a lot of Americans are very pessimistic about the state of the economy, but actually it's better than it ever was. But a lot of people are very pessimistic about it. And it's about people who have the perception that they used to be the powerhouse of America, you know, the working people, the people from, you know, more remote, working, more rural communities, or communities that used to be industrial but are now kind of losing out from the globalization. They feel like there's a lot of unfairness towards them, and they're lost the status that they used to have, which drives them more towards the political actors that feed them what they call like the medium lies and conspiracy theories on why they ended up being the losers, even if that might not completely be true. So I guess that was more of a comment than a question, but that was
comment is great, and a very much on point one. If someone I have a response to that, but if somebody else had a quick response, I wanted to make the floor open for that. If you raise your hand or start talking, otherwise, okay. So the connection, I see a tight connection between this discussion and the initial discussion we had in the course about social cost benefit analysis. And here's the connection. The model that people had, that many policymakers had in mind after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union, was this neoliberal model based on a notion of the human motivations and the human experience that says that we are essentially motivated by a fixed set of preferences that we then tend to go into the world to try to satisfy, and that we are you can do the math and show on the blackboard that if your notional wages are cut, but you get cheaper televisions from China, that you can be made better off. And if that's what you have in mind when you're discussing, when you're setting trade policy, that this is your model of human behavior, then you get implications for that. That says this is that we can effectively take the politics out of economics, to recall the reference that Pini made to the work of John Kenneth Galbraith, that you can and in fact that in this view, political action, collective political action, is generally hostile to human well-being. It's generally, collective political action is designed to seize control of administrative machinery, to divert resources to favored groups and away from the general well-being, which is realized when people can engage voluntarily in market transactions that are mutually enhancing. If we see two people transact, if we see two agents trade, we know that something good has happened, because they wouldn't bother to trade if they weren't made better off. And the more we see of that, the more people are made better off. This is the model that was in people's minds when we implemented the end of history as a rallying cry, in a way, in the 1990s. And in the background of this, I see, is a social welfare function that we're making policies based on maximizing a certain social welfare function that says that what people ultimately fundamentally value is whatever it is that they're buying. That's the rest of it is just kind of talk. I first started my PhD program in agricultural and resource economics at Berkeley. By the way, the alma mater program of John Kenneth Galbraith, and that's why I went there. I read the autobiography of John Kenneth Galbraith, and that is, I had been doing mathematics before, and his autobiography that inspired me to switch into economics. And I went to his program, the program where he got his PhD at Berkeley. So he was actually a huge influence in my life. And by the way, my mom knew him. They were on a board together of a group that was like trying to be the rallying point for the anti-communist left, or the non-communist and anti-communist left in the U.S. and worked on anti-Vietnam War stuff together. But so besides my war stories, why was I telling that? The first week in graduate school, when I encountered the model that I was describing, of fixed stable preferences and people maximizing, the first thing I thought is, there is no religious or cultural tradition in human history that would recognize this as a healthy way of engaging in the human experience and engaging in community. None. This is very off. There's something, and yet, especially increasingly over the 90s, we I believe canonized this model as the model that we are going to use to make policy, and we were oblivious to what I would think of as the how much it matters to people to converse, to feel that they not only about the outcome of the policy process, but that they are an active agent in the policy process. It is, if you go to a restaurant and you sit down and they bring you what they think you want, it's not the same as you getting the menu and you deciding what they want, even if they do bring you what you want. It's something that you, as you having the idea of yourself as an autonomous agent, that you are engaged with others in a community of conversation, is fundamental to democracy. And if I'm really going on a rant here, but it's what the hell? That model of a social welfare function that comes up with the right answer is fundamentally autocratic. It's fundamentally a model of it's a kind of monarch that it's a technocratic benevolent monarch who it kind of says you either are too stupid or inexperienced or ill-informed or just busy and not interested, and therefore these technocrats can extract all this data from society. They can do all their calculations, and they can come up with the right answer and present it to you like the waiter at the restaurant who doesn't bother to ask what you want. And or they could ask ahead of time. Instead of they say, so how much do you enjoy fat versus salt versus sweet? Okay, thank you, we got it, we'll take it from here, and we'll give you the right dish when you finally show up. But next time when you go to another restaurant, they'll bring you the same dish because you've already told us that's what you want. Being a little bit tongue in cheek. So in what I've thought of this course as being is an opportunity for me with Pini's help, with your help, to think about these themes in more depth. And I've actually I'm soliciting suggestions and feedback. I'm thinking of taking the videos and the photos of the whiteboards and so on, and making and I hope with Pini's input, a short book about this. And my working title as of this morning is Beyond Social Cost Benefit Analysis, or What I Wish They Had Taught Me in Graduate School. That decision making, that treating social, or treating public choices, administrative choices about public projects as a technocratic matter of extracting information about people's preferences, and then just arriving at some answer that's treated as an optimum, as if this was a technocratic procedure, just gets a number of things quite wrong. And it's not just about making errors of estimation. It's about the whole thing of thinking about what social choice is and ought to be. So that's my little speech for this morning. I might have more speeches if we're not careful. There was so Yulia, you had another comment. Did you? Yeah. Can you expand on what you were saying before in your chat?
It was the precursor to my speaking out loud, and it feels like, for various reasons, that like narrow-mindedness that your colleague Dr. Pini was talking about was it's encouraged, and it's kind of placated by a lot of political regimes, because it's good to have narrow-minded people, and it's a lot more difficult to have an open-minded civil society that can actually work with each other.
Yeah. Indeed, they're really a pain in the tuchus. Other comments or questions on these themes? All right, I want to then switch over to talk about it's actually not a switch. It's a progression and evolution to talk about social contract theory. So let's just everyone take a breath. Everyone take a breath. Okay. Social contract theory. So the question that social contract theory. Okay, the segue is this. There's the key word in a lot of this discussion is the word of legitimacy. From if an agent of the state or if anyone is exercising authority, people can be okay with authority if they feel that that authority is exercised legitimately, that if the grant of authority was made according to some appropriate process, and if it's constrained by norms, and if it's being done in a responsible way. Okay, the people who tell me that I cannot park my car in front of the fire hydrant or we're in the handicap spot are exercising legitimate authority. I don't feel angry at them for their tyranny and taking away my freedom. I'm at least, and most people are okay with certain amounts of authority if it's exercised legitimately. And what is central then is the question: what confers legitimacy? How does that feeling of legitimacy arise? So this was the central question that social contract theorists were addressing when they started writing in the 17th century, starting with Thomas Hobbes and John Locke in England in the 17th century. They were coming from, as I mentioned last Friday, the medieval tradition had been to treat the authority of the king as granted by God. There is therefore a religious model that described where why the authority of the king was legitimate, because God said so. And if you were opposing the king, you were opposing the legitimacy granted by God, and that made you a very bad person indeed. For various reasons, including the English Civil War. So the English Civil War was an attack on the rule of the monarch, leading to, in fact, the monarch's head getting separated from the rest of his body. And this had, besides political implications, that had intellectual implications. If we can hack the head off of a king, it appears the king, we have to have some narrative about why that is okay. And part of the answer that Hobbes and Locke were working on is to take God out of the mix, to claim this, and this is an absolutely critical move, to move the source of legitimacy from God to human beings. It's a world-shaking shift of orientation to claim that that legitimate authority comes from the governed, not from up in the sky. And the model that Hobbes first developed was to, the story, by the way, I heard about Hobbes is that he was looking at somebody's house, and they had opened a book of Euclid's Elements. You've all studied geometry in high school probably, and you have state your axioms, and you use deductive logic, and you derive your theorems. We've all learned this model. So he looked at this, and he looked at the conclusion, looked at the theorem, and he said, that's wrong. And then he went up and he looked through the argument, and he said, my gosh, that's actually right. I was mistaken. I'm now convinced. And he said, this is the way political theory should be written. And this was his model in mind when he wrote his famous book, Leviathan. And so he described a different model of legitimate authority, that we each have we each come into the world with autonomy, and we collectively decide to transfer our right of self-rule to a sovereign who will exercise it on our behalf and for our benefit. You still have in mind this is a pretty much an absolute monarch. It's a little fuzzy exactly how this grant of authority is achieved or and how it might be taken away, but so it ends up looking a lot like you still have an absolute monarch, but the legitimacy for the monarchy comes from a different place. It comes from the governed rather than from the divine. So you've naturalized your theory of politics. You've taken away the supernatural. Well, you've taken away you've taken heaven out of it, but you still have an arguably supernatural entity, which is human autonomy and human free will. It's not quite clear what is the metaphysical status of these things. Locke it comes along and as I said, by the way, last Friday, the alternative that Hobbes described is a war of all against all, in which the lives for the famous line, the lives for most people are solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's your other option if you don't go along with this program of granting sovereignty to the sovereign. So it's not much of a deal. Might as well be God deciding, because the other option is anarchy, violence, destitution, etc. Hobbes, in his second treatise on government, changes this a bit. It's not quite as pessimistic a world. It's a world in which it starts off from kind of the same place. Everyone has their individual autonomous free will and their ability to their interest in defending themselves. The world in the state of nature isn't quite as nasty as Hobbes. But it's still suboptimal. And Locke changes a couple of things. The grant of authority to a sovereign can be more limited. It's not necessarily a grant of complete authority over everything. You can give a limited grant of authority just over some things while retaining others for yourself. And this is the model that the framers of the U.S. Constitution and well, first the founders who wrote the U.S. Declaration of Independence, and later much of the same group, the framers who framed the U.S. Constitution, had in mind. They were the intellectual heirs to John Locke's thinking. That they thought of themselves as designing a social contract, and this is a revolutionary step in world affairs, of course. But we won't need to go over all the details. You've no doubt heard about this and read about it in history and in political science. But what it does is creates a decision-making structure based on the idea of limited government, limited bequest of authority, separation of powers, and creates really a framework for conversation. Now, James Madison, who was called the architect of the U.S. Constitution, actually had he was in some despair after the Constitutional Convention, 1787. He said, they can't stop arguing. We haven't actually come to a resolution on all these key issues. This is pretty much a failure. And then he had a change of heart. He said, no, actually what we did is we set up the framework for discussion, and they'll just keep arguing. And what government will be is this continuous argument. And that's okay. It's okay that we didn't have all the answers. It's okay that we have that's what the noise of democracy is. The 19th century editor of The Economist magazine, Walter Baggio, he summarized democracy as rule by discussion. Rule by discussion. That the essence is not so much about the answers or the mapping of preferences to outcomes and choices, but about the process itself. To have rule by discussion, of course, that sounds very nice, but there's of course a few things that have to be accepted to have that model. You have to one has to imagine that there's a point to talking if you're going to have rule by discussion. That you actually that when you talk, you are saying something, and that what people are hearing is actually substantive. If you're working from a basis of believing that everyone has fixed and stable preferences, then talk is irrelevant. And there's sort of, what would you say? There's nothing to say. I want this, you want that. This is kind of not, we already have all the information. What is there even to talk about? Describing democracy as rule by discussion allows or actually not just allows, it assumes that there is genuine information to share. There's opportunities for updating beliefs, for updating values, and that conversation actually is essential to that updating process. So there's something about conversation itself as a necessary part of reaching the acceptable and social choices that I think is central, and that the perception that the outcome is legitimate, I think, requires that people feel that they were part of the decision-making process. And to address Yulia's note about the number of people who feel disenfranchised, either through Brexit in the UK or globalization and having their jobs disappear in the US and other places, it seems central that they feel that these discussions were taken, these choices were made without them being involved with it. That the technocratic model of experts figuring out the right thing for you and then delivering it to you is a setup for the kind of resentment and backlash that we've seen in the US and the UK and in other places. So that's my, so I'm going to pause. Are there any comments or questions? Is this, and maybe a basic question, is this stuff interesting? Is this stuff like a good use of your time? I mean, you're not leaving, so I guess it's some legitimacy, some acknowledgement of at least that level of legitimacy. But yes, okay. Mikola, yes, thumbs up.
Talking about legitimacy, as for me, it depends of some background of society and imagination and some cultural experience and practice, because what might be eligible in one country is not eligible not acceptable in other. It different. It's about different cultural code of legitimacy, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
For me, it is so way we need to understand what in the background of society to understand. To modeling to draft this model of social contract and how legitimacy work in this model.
Okay, this is quite interesting. So the basic. Let's start from John Locke's model, that we all are endowed, and I think the most poetic summary of Locke's model is in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And this, although there are actually many authors and editors and committee work on the final text of the Declaration of Independence, I think this most poetic passage is can be credited to Thomas Jefferson, who wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men," he did say men, "all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So the assertion is that that all of us, all humans are granted, or come into the world endowed with rights, and that are intrinsic to us, cannot be taken away. And then if you take a bunch of us together and you let us form a government, there isn't actually, in this simple model, in this simple description, it's not necessary, it's neither necessary nor excluded that culture would matter. That different so there's this kind of an open question. If you take a bunch of Ukrainians and give them this, they're endowed with their rights and they're assigned the job of creating their constitution, would they come up with something that's a lot different from a bunch of Americans or a bunch of British or a bunch of people from Thailand? It's an open question. How much and to what extent would they come up with the same? Would they come up with the same thing or different thing? How would their constitutions fundamentally differ? I hope most places would not make the mistake of giving individuals the unrestricted right to own assault rifles, but that's because that's I'd say a mistake that we made in our U.S. history. But you could say maybe different ideas about how important is the individual vis-a-vis the family or vis-a-vis the community that might be culturally distinct. What are the sense of obligation to elders, sense of obligation to the natural environment might vary and by culture and country, and that might show up in the Constitution. I think it's a really interesting a really interesting question, not one that I feel deeply ready to answer. Was that a useful response, Mikola?
In the general, yes. Maybe I share some experience. For example, the early year of the Ukrainian independence, the social contract was government, you hand out, take out hand from our issue, you blend what you doing on the Pechersk hill. It kind of contract. Then
the contract was you might say, don't ask, don't tell.
Yeah, and this contract changed during the Ukrainian history till February 24, when citizens make ownership of the state. They understand that if they don't defend country and state, they lost everything, and it emerged new contract. You are together. But if you can observe during this war year, even this contract now work in progress.
Yes,
changing.
This I think. To me, this sounds absolutely right, and this is one of the several reasons that I find Ukraine fascinating, because I feel like you're seeing this process moving in fast forward. It's like a video on high speed, seeing the social contract evolving over the past 32 years since independence. And I think it's a great story.
Maybe one remark. Why this first social contract in Ukraine been so? Because we have social historical trauma from the relation with state, because state was not us. State was repressive, and we and people try to avoid contract with state. It because experience, it because background, and we need the time to change the mind and understand the state is a service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is and that is both deeply important and also fascinating change of mindset, to see the state as a the state as fundamentally coming from or representing a collective response to needs. So we're coming to the towards the end of the period. I want to leave a couple of minutes to talk about the assignments, but I also want to see if there's any other comments or questions of what we've discussed today. Yulia, you look like you have something on mind. No.
Yeah, actually, but it was about the state and the relationship with people, and it was more of something I remembered from back when I was reading articles trying to find a master's thesis topic. I was interested in corruption and why the perception of it and mistrust of the state is so high in post-Soviet countries, and one of the mechanisms of how it occurred. And it was a really interesting study that was conducted in Russia about how there was still corruption in the Soviet Union, but it was very hidden, and people knew very well how it would work and whom you have to know to get what you needed. And then when the social kind of network started breaking up because the countries were transitioning, that network was no longer reliable, and people did not know or understand how this corrupt system works and whose hand you have to grease to get what you needed, because the system in the Soviet Union wasn't ineffective either, and it was all about connections and knowing the right person. So the sense of not understanding how system works anymore, or who you have to know and where you have to go, made it unreliable and ineffective in people's perception, which is why the perception of, people still knew that there was some corruption that you can use to get what you needed or to get results, but people did not quite understand how it's supposed to work and how to make it efficient, which is why it raised this feeling of uncertainty and discomfort with how things work, and the discomfort with knowing whether or not you're going to get the result you want. And that kind of was one of the reasons of such high perceptions of corruption in post-Soviet countries.
That is really interesting. That is really interesting. The idea that we used to have corruption, but I knew how it worked, so it wasn't that bad. But a corruption that's just kind of diffuse and out there, and I have no connection to it, and I can't make it work for me, therefore makes it, it is objectively worse, and therefore I guess you perceive it as also being worse. This is quite interesting. And generally feeling like the system has changed, and you no longer know this system, and you no longer know how to interact with it, is seems like a very strong common theme from the West to East.
Yeah, and it's also a hit or miss thing, especially for the petty, like where the levels where the corruption is petty, because there's a lot of institutions where you will get the result in your service that you need without any bribes, and there are a lot fewer than there used to be, but still places where it seems you frustratingly cannot get the result that you want, which is kind of exacerbates that uncertainty.
We are going over time, but I'm going to ask a question that's on my mind. Do you feel like the digitalization initiatives, do they feel like they are addressing petty corruption? Like the fact that you can do things on an app on your phone, does that actually have an impact on how you feel about your interactions with the state, or whether whether you are coming up against the need for opportunity for petty corruption?
Well, I'm probably the wrong person to ask before, because I work in the agency that supports digitalization, and of course we believe that it's going to solve a lot of problems and make people's lives better. But I don't think there have been like real studies that would connect the digitalization and perception of corruption. I mean, my instinct would be to think that yes, it would, but I think we have to see, and maybe that's going to be the thesis for my master's topic for my master's thesis.
That's a great topic. Any other comments from anyone else about digitalization and perceptions of corruption?
It's not same, because digitalization is more about take something easy, to make relation with state, with some provider easy, but corruption is about security. Because why corruption emerged? Because the early year of the independence and in the Soviet period, corruption was a way to avoid some repression, yes, some repression impact of the state. And if a citizen feel the threat from the state, the perception of corruption still higher. Digitalization in part of the solution, but not entire solution. We need this two-way change the design of the state and add the technology.
Right. So still reform of institutions that you connect with, as well as changing the mode of the connection. Okay, we are now a little over time, so I'm going to just make briefly a couple of notes on process. So first, yeah.
May I make some small remark about the digitalization and corruption? Just more.
Sure. Go ahead quickly, please.
I think that digitalization is very important for reducing corruption, but it's more important to have a real democratic civil control of society over the state. I think the idea of representative democracy is a strong democratic civilian control over the state, which is in Ukraine is proclaimed, but it doesn't really exist. So the society doesn't really, let's say, not control, but at least monitor the state activity. So I think until we don't have a real democratic civilian control, well, the state will responsible and transferable to society, and that would be very difficult to overcome the corruption. So democratic civil control, I think it's a key issue for Ukraine.
Great comment, and so yes, it is. There is a risk of being sometimes, technologies can do great things for us, and there's a risk of saying, this is the answer. We just need a better gadget, better update our apps. Then we'll have nirvana. So very well-spoken point about the fundamental need for democratic institutions. Okay, your assignments. but thank you, Oleg. Your assignments, only a few people indicated an interest in doing a presentation. I'm going to expect at this point, unless someone really tells me right away that they still want in on this deal, that those are the I think I received 5, and I haven't responded individually to you all, but I will give you some feedback. I hope first that the description I put on the whiteboard of the 4, the slides, the structure of the presentation, and what you should handle in each of the slides was sufficiently descriptive. If it was not, definitely let me know if you have questions. This Friday, we will set aside time for hearing those presentations. So I'm quite open to being in conversation with you about your presentation up to a reasonable limit. It's still your presentation, not mine. But I'm quite keen to learn what you have to say about this. Again, we're looking at this as an opportunity both to learn about and think about a particular social program, whether that's memorialization or trauma care services or demining or whatnot, and also an opportunity to evaluate different ways of evaluating projects. That is, to analyze how the way that we evaluate projects can inform what we think about the projects. And that's really the fundamental theme of the course, and the project itself. Its content is, of course, important, but the comparative analysis of different ways of evaluating projects is really something that I hope will come through in the presentations. Finally, Pina and I want to extend an invitation for those who are available and interested. We are interested in hosting a dinner on Friday evening at a traditional Ukrainian restaurant, and we're looking at we're talking about 5:30 to 8 p.m. and our treat. We'll send out an announcement about that, but want to make you aware of that, and we'll be asking for a head count for how many will be able to make it, and also I would like one volunteer to help with the making sure that I'm not making a translation error. Somebody to help with interface with the restaurant people, so that we make sure this goes smoothly. So if anyone is interested in volunteering to help with that, I'd appreciate it. And other than that, we're now at 8 minutes after the hour, so we're going to wrap it up. Thanks very much. Thanks everyone very much, and we'll see you tomorrow.
See you. Bye.
Thank you too. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.